The morning Rowan Ashford walked into the Fairmont to finalize a hotel acquisition deal. He had not slept in 4 days, not because of the deal. The deal was the easy part. The hard part was that his wife had been missing for 3 months, and the police had quietly stopped looking. He straightened his tie in the lobby's mirror out of habit. A habit she used to tease him about. "You fix your tie when you're nervous, Rowan. You've been doing it since the day we met." He dropped his hand. The marble floor gleamed beneath the chandelier light, and somewhere in the distance a trolley rattled across the corridor. The Fairmont, Ottawa was the kind of hotel that smelled like old money and fresh flowers, and it occurred to him, distantly, that he had never noticed either of those things until she was gone. His assistant, a sharp young man named Patrick Ossie, was already waiting near the elevator with a folder of contracts. "Mr. Ashford, the Brennan Group is upstairs, they're ready when you are." Rowan nodded. He was always ready. That was what people said about him. Rowan Ashford is always ready. Rowan Ashford built Ashford Capital from a single commercial property in Gatineau into a portfolio that stretched from Halifax to Vancouver. Rowan Ashford did not lose composure. Rowan Ashford did not fall apart. Rowan Ashford had also, apparently, not noticed that his wife was drowning right beside him until she disappeared without leaving a note. He followed Patrick toward the elevator. As they passed the wide corridor that led to the banquet halls, Rowan glanced left out of old instinct. He always checked sightlines in unfamiliar buildings, a habit from his early days doing walkthroughs alone. And that was when he stopped walking. There was a woman at the far end of the corridor pushing a housekeeping cart. Her hair was tied back under a white cap. She wore the hotel's gray uniform, the kind with the small gold crest on the chest. She was moving slowly, methodically, pulling fresh towels from the cart shelf and restacking them with the kind of quiet precision that told you she had been doing it long enough to stop thinking about it. She was also very clearly pregnant. Rowan did not breathe. He had spent 3 months staring at the back of strangers' heads on Rideau Street. He had called out to women in parking lots who turned around and looked at him like he was unwell. He had learned, painfully, what grief does to recognition. How the mind starts manufacturing her in crowds, in reflections, in the wrong woman's posture. His therapist, whom his mother had arranged after the first month, had given it a name. He had stopped going after the second session, but this was not grief manufacturing something. This was his wife's hands. He knew those hands. He had watched them wrap around a coffee mug every morning for 6 years. He had held them in a hospital room when her mother was sick. He had reached for them in the dark on nights when neither of them could sleep and they lay there not speaking, just holding on. The woman reached up to adjust something on the top shelf of the cart, and the movement pulled her profile into the light. Rowan's folder hit the floor. Her name was Lily Ashford. Before she married him, she had been Lily Tremaine, the second daughter of a retired schoolteacher from Charlottetown, and a man who fixed boat engines for a living. She had a degree in social work from Dalhousie that she'd paid for herself with bursaries and weekend shifts at a bakery. She laughed too loudly at her own jokes. She remembered every birthday. She kept a list on her phone of good things that had happened each week. Not because she was naive, she always said, but because the bad things kept their own list without any help. He had fallen in love with her at a charity gala in Toronto 7 years ago, where she had been volunteering at the coat check, and had argued politely but firmly with a man twice her age, about whether the event's donation model was actually effective. The man had been one of Rowan's largest investors. Rowan had stood nearby long enough to hear her make 3 points he couldn't counter, then introduced himself. She had shaken his hand and said, "Nice to meet you, Mr. Ashford," as though he were simply the next person in line, which in that moment he very much was. He had known, somewhere quiet and certain, that he was finished. They married 18 months later. And if there was one thing Rowan had failed to prepare for, one thing no deal due diligence could have predicted, it was his mother, Constance Ashford. 71 years old, silver-haired, impeccably dressed and possessed of a warmth so precisely calibrated that it functioned, in practice, like a scalpel. She had raised Rowan alone after his father left, and she had done it well, and she had never once let him forget it, not cruelly. That was the thing people never understood about Constance. She was never cruel. She was simply always present, always involved. Always the authority in every room she entered, including rooms in his own house. She had smiled at Lily on their wedding day. She had complimented the flowers. She had given a toast that made half the room cry. And then, the following Monday, she had called Rowan and spent 45 minutes explaining, in the gentlest possible language, why Lily was not quite right for him. Rowan had not ended that call. That was the first failure. There would be others. Constance did not argue with Lily. She observed her. She asked questions at family dinners that weren't quite accusations but somehow left Lily feeling she needed to justify herself. She called Rowan's office. Not his cell, his office, to discuss concerns about Lily's influence on certain business decisions. She arrived at the house on Sunday mornings without calling ahead, which Lily had asked her twice politely not to do. And when Lily asked Rowan to say something, he said something, but not quite enough, and not quite clearly. and Constance, who had been reading between his lines since he was 4 years old, continued doing exactly as she pleased. Rowan knew all of this. He had known it while it was happening. He had told himself he was managing it. He had told himself Lily was strong enough to handle it, which was a coward's logic. The logic of a man who confused his wife's endurance with her consent to keep enduring. He knew that now. He had had 3 months to know it. The pregnancy had not been planned, but it had not been unwelcome. Lily had told him on a Tuesday evening in October, standing in their kitchen in Westboro with a test in her hand and an expression he couldn't fully read. Something between hope and wariness, watching his face for the real answer before he spoke. He had crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and held her, and the wariness had dissolved. They had sat up until midnight talking about names and timelines, and whether they'd need to rethink the guest room, and Rowan had gone to bed feeling, for the first time in a long while, like the ground under them was solid. He had told his mother the following weekend. Constance had smiled, she had said all the right things, and then over the following weeks, the questions began. Subtle ones, whether Lily had been to see a specialist, the right kind, dear, not just a general practitioner, whether Lily was managing her stress levels, whether Rowan was aware that her family had a history of, well, she didn't want to be alarmist, but had he asked? And Lily, who heard none of these conversations directly but felt their aftershock in the way Rowan came home from his mother's, slightly distant, slightly preoccupied. Lily began to go quiet. Not all at once. That was the thing. It happened the way a tide goes out. Gradually enough that you didn't notice until you looked up and the water was somewhere far away. She stopped bringing things up at dinner. She stopped adding things to the list on her phone. He'd noticed that only later, scrolling through it in the months after she left, finding the last entry dated November 14th. Good coffee at Bridgehead. Rowan remembered the thing about the bread. That was the last one. In December, Constance Ashford called Lily directly for the first time. Rowan didn't know about the call until much later. He didn't know what was said. He didn't know what Constance's voice sounded like on the other end of that phone. Or what precise combination of words she had chosen. Or how long Lily had sat on the edge of the bed afterward holding the phone in her lap before she got up and started making dinner. He only knew that on the 1st of January he woke up and Lily was gone. There was no note. There was nothing missing except the bag she kept packed for overnight trips, her personal documents from the fireproof box in the closet, and the small photograph she kept on her nightstand. Her parents on their wedding day, her mother in a yellow dress, both of them laughing at something off camera. He had not known about the photograph until it wasn't there. He had called the police. He had hired a private investigator. He had stood in their Westboro house at 2 in the morning calling her number until the voicemail stopped accepting messages. He had driven to Charlottetown in February and sat across from her father in a small kitchen that smelled like wood smoke, and asked if she had come home. And the man had looked at him for a long time before saying, "She hasn't called us either, son. But if she did, I reckon she'd have a reason for not wanting you to know." Rowan had driven back to Ottawa in silence. He had asked himself, on that drive, what reason she would have. And somewhere on the 417, with the snow coming sideways across the highway and the windshield wipers struggling to keep pace, he had understood that the reason was him. Not only his mother, him, his silence, his management, his assumption that endurance was the same as acceptance, and that a strong woman choosing to stay was the same as a woman choosing to be happy. He had pulled over and sat on the shoulder of the highway for 20 minutes, and the transport trucks had shaken the car as they passed, and he had not cried. He hadn't been able to. But something in him had shifted quietly and permanently, the way ice shifts on a river in early spring, before the crack. The woman at the end of the corridor had not seen him. Rowan crossed the distance without remembering deciding to move. Patrick said something behind him. His name, probably, and he heard it the way you hear sound through glass, muffled and irrelevant. The chandelier light grew around him and the marble was cold underfoot, and then he was close enough to see the small name tag on her uniform, and it said Lily, and the world went very still. She turned because she heard footsteps. She looked up, and the expression on her face, the first half-second of it before she had time to compose herself, was not surprise, it was fear that hit him harder than anything else could have. He stopped. He did not reach for her. He did not say her name loudly. He looked at her, and at the visible curve of pregnancy beneath her uniform, and he looked at her face which he had memorized in all its versions, and he said, very quietly, "Lily." She glanced down the corridor, a reflex, checking for exits or witnesses or something. That reflex told him everything about the months between January and now, and something cold moved through him. "Not here," she said. Her voice was lower than he remembered. "Dear Rowan, not here." "Okay," he said. She glanced toward a door further down the corridor. "Break room," the sign said. She looked at him once more. Not warmly, not coldly, just measuring. And then she pushed the cart against the wall and walked to the door and pushed it open, and he followed. The break room smelled like instant coffee and somebody's reheated lunch. There was a round table with 4 plastic chairs, a countertop with a kettle, a bulletin board covered in shift schedules and a laminated copy of the hotel's evacuation plan. A window looked out onto a narrow alley, gray January light falling through it without conviction. Lily sat down. She placed her hands flat on the table. She did not look at him. Rowan sat across from her. He did not know what he had planned to say in this moment. He had imagined it hundreds of times, but none of those imagined versions had been this room, or that name tag, or the particular way she was holding herself, not frightened exactly but braced. "How long have you been here?" he asked. 6 weeks, and before? A pause. "Kingston then, here are you." He stopped. He started again. "Is the baby?" "We're both fine," she said it crisply, like a report, like she had said it to people before. He nodded. He put his hands on the table, not reaching for hers, just making himself stay still. "Lily, I need you to tell me what she said to you." For the first time she looked at him. "You know, I know enough, I don't know the specific words." She held his gaze for a moment, then she looked out the window. "She called me in December. She told me that you'd been speaking to a lawyer, about options. In case the marriage," she said, "in case the marriage wasn't working." She paused. "She said you hadn't wanted to tell me yourself because of the pregnancy, that you didn't want to upset me." Rowan felt the blood leave his face. "She said she thought I deserved to know." Quietly, before things became complicated. Lily's voice was even, almost rehearsed, the voice of someone who had told this story to themselves enough times to drain the worst of it out. "She said there was a figure, a settlement, that you'd already been discussing it." "That is not true." His voice came out low and very flat. "There is no lawyer, there is no settlement. I have not said a word of that to anyone, let alone to her, let alone about you. I know that now." She said it simply, without accusation. He blinked. "You know, I've had 3 months, Rowan." She turned back to him. "A long time to sit with something and figure out whether it feels like the truth. At first I believed her because," she stopped, "because I'd been waiting for something like that to happen. I thought I'd been waiting for you to say it. Turned out I was just waiting for someone to say it, and she got there first." The honesty of that landed in his chest like a stone dropped into still water. "And by the time I understood that, I was already gone, and I didn't know how to come back from gone." She looked down at her hands. "I was also by then very tired of the house, yes, of your mother's number on the caller ID, of feeling like a guest at my own dinner table." She said it without heat, which somehow made it worse. "I was tired, Rowan. I needed to not be there." He was quiet for a moment. "You needed to not be there, so you became a housekeeper at a hotel." "I needed work I could do while pregnant that nobody would ask questions about. I needed somewhere to sleep." She said it plainly. "I'm not asking for sympathy. I made choices. They weren't the best choices, but they were mine." "You should have had better choices," he said. She looked at him. "You should have had a home that felt like yours. You should have had a husband who made that happen. Those are the things that should have been different. Not your choices in December. Mine, for the 2 years before December." Lily said nothing, but something in her face shifted. The slightest change, like a door opening an inch. "I spoke to my mother," he said. "After you left I had the conversation I should have had a long time ago." He paused. "It took longer than it should have because I kept waiting for the right moment, and there was never a right moment. And in the meantime you were standing in the wreckage of waiting." "I understand that. I'm not asking you to credit me for having the conversation too late. I'm telling you I had it, and I've since spoken to a solicitor." She was very still. "Not the kind she told you about," he said. "A different kind. One that drafts legally binding agreements about the terms of contact between my mother and our home." He let that settle. "It's not a perfect solution. It's a beginning of one." Outside, a delivery truck rumbled through the alley. The kettle on the countertop clicked faintly as it cooled. "Why are you here?" she asked. "The hotel. Why today?" "An acquisition meeting, the Brennan Group." He almost said it was irrelevant, but something stopped him. "I don't know, Lily. I don't know if it matters. I've been looking for you since January. I hired someone. He didn't find you. I drove to Charlottetown and your father told me something that he stopped. He said if you'd reached out and hadn't wanted me to know where you were, you'd have a reason. And he was right. You did." She was quiet for a long moment. "Your father also," Rowan said carefully, "asked me whether I knew what a good woman looked like when she was deciding not to be treated badly anymore. I told him I was beginning to understand." He paused. "He said to tell you that your mother's yellow dress from the photo is in his closet, and it's been there 23 years and he hasn't moved it once." Something broke very quietly in Lily's expression. She pressed her fingers over her mouth for a moment. Just a moment. Then she put her hand back down on the table. "I'm not asking you to come home today," Rowan said. "Or to forgive anything today. I'm asking whether we can sit somewhere warmer than this and have an actual conversation. As people who," he stopped. He found the words that were true. "As two people who used to be good at talking to each other, when I wasn't in the way of it." She looked at him for a long time. The gray light from the alley window sat between them, quiet and without demand. Then she said, "I'm off shift at 4. "Okay," he said. "There's a place on Spark Street. They have decent soup. It won't be the Fairmont, but I don't need it to be the Fairmont." He meant it so completely that it surprised even him. She studied him once more. That careful measuring look she'd learned, he realized. Not in the last 3 months but in the years before, the habit of watching for the gap between what he said and what he did. He hoped, with a seriousness he hadn't known he was capable of before January, that the gap would get smaller, that he would close it, that she would in time believe him. 4 o'clock, she said. Don't be late. He shook his head. I won't be. He went upstairs and completed the meeting. He signed 2 documents and made 4 decisions, and answered questions that 3 months ago would have had his full attention. Patrick watched him with the quiet professional concern of someone paid to notice things, and did not ask. Rowan was grateful for that. At 3:40 he was standing in the lobby. At 3:50 he stepped outside and called a number he had saved under no name, just a letter his mother answered on the second ring. Rowan, her voice was warm, it was always warm. How did the Brennan meeting go, sweetheart? I found Lily, he said. The silence was brief, careful. Oh Rowan, thank goodness. Where, you called her in December, he said. And you told her I had engaged a lawyer. That I was looking at a settlement. The silence this time was different. She left, he said. She's been working at a hotel. She's 8 months pregnant and she's been working at a hotel in Ottawa, because you told her a lie and I had given her no reason to doubt it. He kept his voice level, not because he wasn't angry, because he had decided, sometime in the past 4 days when he hadn't slept, that level was the register he needed. That shouting was what she knew how to navigate. Level was new territory. I'm going to meet her at 4 o'clock and I'm going to start the process of undoing as much of this as I can undo. Rowan, I know what you were only doing. He looked at the street outside, the cold Ottawa afternoon, a man walking a dog, 2 students on bikes, the ordinary world. I need you to understand something, Mum, not as your son, as my own person making my own decision. If Lily is willing to rebuild this marriage, she will do it in a home where you are a guest who calls ahead and comes when invited. Not an authority, not an advisor, a guest. He paused. If that's not a role you can accept, then we will love each other from a greater distance. And I will be sad about that, and it will still be true. A long silence when Constance Ashford spoke again. Her voice was quieter than he had ever heard it. Not defeated exactly. Something more complicated than that. Is she all right, she asked. She's going to be. He hung up. He stood on the sidewalk in the cold, the phone in his coat pocket, his hands at his sides. He was not shaking. He noted that with something close to surprise. At 4:02, Lily Ashford came through the staff exit of the Fairmont in a dark coat that no longer buttoned properly over her stomach, a bag on one shoulder, her hair down now without the cap. She looked, for just a second, the way she had at that coat check in Toronto 7 years ago, like someone who had already decided something and was waiting to see if the world would get out of the way. She saw him. She didn't smile, not quite, but she didn't look away. They walked together down Spark Street in the gray January cold, not touching, not talking yet, just walking. 2 people beginning the long and imperfect work of finding the solid ground again. Not all conversations could happen at once. Not all damage could be measured in an afternoon. But there was a soup place on the corner, and the lights were on inside, and the world for now was only as large as that.